The morning Ellen Conley climbed to the top rung of her rickety ladder with a paint-soaked brush in her hand and pure stubbornness in her heart. Every man in Harlow Creek, Texas, found something else that needed doing. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlow Creek sat low in a shallow valley where the Brazos River bent like an old man's elbow, surrounded by sun-scorched prairie that stretched in every direction until the sky swallowed it whole. The town was not large, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and perhaps 30 homes scattered like dice that had been thrown without aim. It was the kind of town where everybody knew your business before you knew it yourself, and where reputation was the currency that bought you everything, or bought you nothing at all. Ellen Conley was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat when she worked, and green eyes that had learned a long time ago to hold their own counsel. She had come to Harlow Creek 8 years earlier as the bride of Thomas Conley, a good man who had worked a modest cattle operation on 20 acres just east of town. Thomas had been tall and quiet and decent, and Ellen had loved him in the way that one loves something solid and true. He had died the previous autumn of fever that had come hard and fast, the way fevers did in those days, taking hold on a Tuesday and finishing its business by Saturday. He left Ellen with a 7-year-old daughter named Clara, a modest house that needed painting something terrible, 2 horses, a small vegetable garden, and debts that were modest enough that they could be managed if she was careful and industrious. She had been careful. She had been industrious. She had sold 2 of the 3 remaining cattle Thomas had kept, managed the garden through the winter, taken in sewing work from 3 of the women in town, and done her accounts with the kind of precision that would have surprised anyone who had not known her well. By March of 1878, Ellen Conley had survived her first winter as a widow, and she intended to keep surviving. The house, however, was becoming a problem. Thomas had last painted it in the summer of 1874, and the Texas sun was not kind to paint. The white had gone gray and then begun to peel in long curling strips that fell into the dirt around the foundation like shed skin. The wood beneath was exposed in patches, and Ellen knew well enough that exposed wood in the humid Texas spring was an invitation to rot and ruin. She had money enough for paint. She had budgeted carefully for it, and she had arms and legs and a will that had seen her through worse. What she needed was someone to help her, because a house could not be painted by one person working alone in any kind of reasonable time, and she had Clara to mind and sewing work to finish, and there were only so many hours in a day. She had asked 6 men. The first was Harold Greer, who ran the general store and had been a friendly acquaintance of Thomas's. Harold had nodded and said he was awful busy with inventory and maybe in a few weeks. The few weeks had come and gone without Harold appearing on her doorstep with a brush. The second was Caleb Morton, who was a neighbor 3 properties down and had once helped Thomas repair a fence post. Caleb had looked at his boots and said his back was giving him trouble. The third, fourth, and fifth were men from the church congregation who had shaken Thomas's hand at every Sunday service for years. They had offered condolences and prayers and a covered dish here and there in the months after the funeral, but when it came to showing up with work in their hands, they had found the hours were not available. The 6th was Reverend Aldous Pierce himself, who had said that it was an admirable project, and that perhaps she might find someone willing to help if she asked around. And then he had looked at her with that particular expression that men in Harlow Creek reserved for Ellen, the one that said she was a woman alone, and that was a complicated thing, and that there were reasons, unspoken and pointed as fence wire, why a man of standing in the community could not be seen giving his afternoon to a widow woman's house. Ellen understood the reasons. She understood them the way she understood the weight of a bucket of water completely, bodily, without needing anyone to explain the physics to her. Thomas had been gone 7 months. In the arithmetic of small-town respectability, that was not long enough. A widow was a delicate social creature in 1878, and any man who devoted his time and labor to her property was, in the eyes of Harlow Creek, making a statement of some kind. They were not prepared to make that statement. They were not prepared to risk their wives' narrowed eyes or the raised eyebrows at Sunday service. So Ellen Conley bought 2 cans of white paint from Harold Greer, who took her money without comment and whose cheeks went slightly pink. And she borrowed a ladder from the livery owner, Bill Potts, who lent it without making eye contact. And she mixed the paint the evening of April the 14th, and she got up before the sun on April the 15th, and she set that ladder against the east wall of her house, and she began. Clara was still sleeping when Ellen climbed to the top that first morning, and the prairie around her was gray and quiet and cool in the way it only was for that one sweet hour before the sun began its assault. Ellen dipped her brush and she painted. She was methodical about it. She started at the top and worked down in long vertical strokes the way Thomas had taught her, overlapping each stroke so there were no thin patches. She did not think about what the town thought. She did not think about what was proper or improper. She thought about the wood beneath the peeling paint, and she thought about the house she and Thomas had built their life in, and she thought about Clara, who deserved to grow up in a home that stood straight and proud, and she kept painting. By the time Clara came outside with her shoes unlaced and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, asking for breakfast, Ellen had finished the upper third of the east wall. "Mama, you're up high," Clara said, tipping her head back. "I am," Ellen agreed, descending the ladder. "Come on then. Biscuits, and then I'll need you to help me move the ladder." Clara was a small, serious child with her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she accepted the task of ladder moving with the gravity of an engineer. They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, and then Ellen went back outside and Clara sat on the porch steps with her primer and practiced her letters while Ellen painted. By mid-morning, 2 women from town had walked past on the road. Ellen saw them slow their steps. She kept painting. She heard them resume walking and speak to each other in voices too low to catch. She kept painting. By noon she had finished the east wall below the second-story window, and her shoulder ached in a way that was more conversation than complaint. She ate a cold lunch standing at the kitchen counter, drank 2 full glasses of well water, and went back out. By 3 in the afternoon, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, the wife of the hardware man, a woman who wore her opinions the way other women wore bonnets, openly and at all times, had walked up to the fence at the edge of the property and stood watching Ellen work from the south wall she had moved to. "You are going to exhaust yourself," Dorothy said. Ellen looked down from the ladder. "I expect I might. You could ask the church to organize a work party." "I did ask," Ellen said pleasantly. "I asked Reverend Pierce." Dorothy's expression shifted in a way that said she knew the shape of what had happened without needing details. "I could ask my Samuel," she said, and then appeared to think better of it because she added nothing further. "I appreciate the thought," Ellen said, and dipped her brush again. Dorothy stood there a moment longer, then walked on. Ellen kept painting. That was the afternoon that Frederick Bailey rode into Harlow Creek. He came down the main road from the north, which was the direction of Abilene, on a bay horse that was road dusty but sound, with a bedroll strapped behind the saddle and a canvas bag over the horn that held his tools. He was 34 years old, lean in the way of a man who had spent years on horseback and working with his hands, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the river on an overcast day, a deep, unsettled gray-green that changed depending on the light. He had a jaw that was square and stubbled, and a mouth that rested in a neutral line that was not unfriendly so much as reserved, the expression of a man who was accustomed to reading a situation before committing himself to it. Frederick Bailey was a craftsman. He had grown up in Tennessee, the son of a carpenter, and had learned his father's trade well before he had decided, at 23, that the West offered more opportunity than the post-war South was managing to provide. He had spent the past 11 years making his way across the frontier, doing carpentry and repair work in one town after another, building up a reputation for sound, honest work, staying long enough in each place to fulfill his contracts and no longer. He was not a drifter in the aimless sense. He had direction, and he had craft, and he had a quiet sense of purpose, but he had not yet found a place that made him want to set down his bedroll and not pick it up again. He pulled up in front of the general store and swung down from his horse with the easy motion of a man comfortable in his own body, looped the reins over the hitching post, and went inside. Harold Greer looked up from behind the counter with the measuring expression that store owners in small towns always had for strangers. "Afternoon," Frederick said. "I'm looking for work. Carpentry, repair, general building. My name's Bailey, Frederick Bailey, out of Abilene most recently." Harold Greer did what small-town storekeepers always did, which was to assess the man thoroughly while appearing to consider the question. "We've got a man who does most of the repair work in town," he said. "Jed Holloway, he's keeping pretty busy." "I figured as much," Frederick said without offense. "Any building projects, anyone looking to expand a structure or put up something new." Harold tapped his fingers on the counter. "Pete Dawson's been talking about adding a room to his house. Don't know if he's committed to it yet. And the livery could use some work on the south side. Bill Potts knows it. He just hasn't gotten around to hiring anyone." "I'll speak to them," Frederick said. "Is there a place I can board my horse and find a meal and a room?" Harold directed him to the livery and to the Harlow Creek boarding house, which was run by a widow named Mrs. Garrett who had 2 spare rooms and made a respectable supper. Frederick thanked him, untied his horse, and led the animal down the main street. It was on that walk that he first saw Ellen Conley. He was passing the eastern end of the main road where it curved gently south before splitting into the scatter of residential properties. And there she was, perched on the 3rd rung from the top of a ladder propped against the side of a house, painting in long, steady strokes. The house was clearly mid-project. One wall was freshly white and bright in the afternoon sun. The wall she was working on was half done, and the rest of the structure still wore the peeled and graying face of neglect. She was wearing a plain blue work dress with an apron over it, and there was paint on her left forearm and a small dash of it on her cheek that she had not noticed, and she was working with the focused concentration of someone who had decided on a thing and was going to finish it regardless of what the universe intended. Frederick slowed his horse without entirely meaning to. He noticed several things in quick succession. He noticed that she was alone. No one else was painting or moving materials or doing anything supportive. He noticed that there was only one ladder and only one can of paint visible. He noticed, from the angle of the sun and the extent of the work completed, that she had been at this for most of the day by herself. And he noticed that the section of wall she was trying to reach from the top of the ladder was an awkward angle that was going to be difficult to manage without either a second ladder or a longer arm than she had. He did not stop to think about it at great length. That was not his nature. Frederick Bailey was a man who saw a problem and moved toward it the way water moved toward a low place, not because he had considered the philosophy of it, but because it was the obvious direction. He tied his horse to the fence post at the edge of the property, opened his canvas tool bag, and took out the wide, flat brush he used for large surface work. He found the paint can stacked near the base of the house, pried the lid off the second one, which was unopened, and dipped the brush. Then he put the ladder on the opposite side of the section Ellen was working on, climbed it, and began painting. Ellen heard the scrape of a second ladder against the siding and looked sharply to her left. A man she had never seen before was on a ladder beside hers, painting her house, without having said a word or asked her permission. "Excuse me," she said, in a tone that was not entirely welcoming. "What do you think you are doing?" He glanced at her. The gray-green eyes were calm and direct. "Painting," he said. "Seemed like you could use a second brush." "I did not ask for your help." "No," he agreed and kept painting. Ellen stared at him. She was not, by temperament, a woman who was easily rendered speechless, but the sheer casual confidence of it, The way he had simply appeared and applied himself to her problem as though it were the most natural thing in the world had taken her full measure of words away for a moment. "You are a stranger," she said, recovering. "I do not know you." "Frederick Bailey," he said, not stopping. "Carpenter, just rode in from Abilene. Your wall needed painting and you were doing it alone. I had a brush." He paused for the length of one stroke. "I apologize for not asking first. Seemed like the sort of thing that could wait until I'd made myself useful." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. He was not looking at her now, he was looking at the wall, painting with efficient, even strokes, and he was not performing or posturing. He was simply working. She found, to her own faint irritation, that she could not identify a reasonable objection to raise. "I am Ellen Conley," she said. "Mrs. Conley," he said. "The paint needs to go on in vertical strokes," she said, because she had to say something and she would not say thank you yet, not when she had not asked for this. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and adjusted his strokes without a word of complaint. They painted for the next 40 minutes without speaking, and in that silence something happened that Ellen would not have been able to describe precisely if someone had asked her. It was not nothing, that silence. It was the particular silence of two people working toward the same end, and it had a quality to it that she noticed the way she might notice a change in the weather, a shift in pressure, a change in temperature, something that made the air feel different without knowing exactly why. Clara came around the side of the house at 4:30, stopped dead, and stared at Frederick with the direct and unembarrassed scrutiny of a 7-year-old. "Who are you?" she asked. "Frederick Bailey," he said, looking down at her with an expression that was not condescending, just honest. "I'm helping your mother paint." "She didn't say she was getting help," Clara said, looking at Ellen with mild accusation. "It was unexpected," Ellen said dryly. Clara looked at Frederick again. "Do you know how to paint good?" "Well," Ellen corrected automatically. "Do you know how to paint well?" Clara repeated, with the patience of a child who understood that her mother and the rules of grammar were forces of nature equally unavoidable. "I do a decent job," Frederick said. He climbed down his ladder, held the brush out toward Clara with the handle forward. "Would you like to try the low part, close to the ground?" Clara looked at her mother. Ellen hesitated, then gave a small nod. Clara took the brush with great ceremony and applied herself to the lowest 8 inches of the wall with an expression of solemn dedication that made the corner of Frederick's mouth turn up in a way he did not quite succeed in suppressing. Ellen, watching him watch her daughter, felt something in her chest do a small and inconvenient thing that she chose, at that particular moment, to ignore. They stopped when the light went too low to see the paint clearly. Frederick cleaned his brush at the water barrel and Ellen cleaned hers beside him, and Clara, who had painted approximately 2 square feet of wall with a thoroughness that would have impressed a master craftsman, had gone inside to start the fire in the stove for supper. "Thank you," Ellen said, because the work was done and the silence had run its natural course and the word was simply true. "For today." Frederick dried his brush on a cloth and looked at the wall, which was more than half done now. "I'll come back tomorrow if that's agreeable," he said. "Shouldn't take more than 2 more days to finish if the weather holds." Ellen looked at him carefully. "Why?" she asked, because she had lived in a world long enough to know that things given freely often came with a price that was not named at the outset. He met her eyes steadily. "Because the job isn't finished," he said, "and because it's the right thing to do." She held his gaze for a moment, reading him the way she had learned to read people, for the small tells, the shifts of expression, the things that moved beneath the words like fish beneath still water. She found nothing in him that made her cautious. She found, in fact, something that she recognized, the particular quality of a person who was exactly what they appeared to be, without ornament or performance. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." He nodded, untied his horse from the fence post, and rode toward town, and Ellen watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she went inside to help Clara with supper. The boarding house where Frederick took his room was a neat frame building 3 streets over from the main road, run by Mrs. Adelaide Garrett, who was a compact woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, and a sympathetic manner, and the particular authority of someone who had been managing things alone for a long time. She set supper on the table at 6, and there were 2 other boarders, a young railroad surveyor named Chester Banks who had been in town 3 weeks and talked a great deal, and an older traveling salesman named Horace who talked not at all. At supper, Frederick mentioned that he had helped Mrs. Conley with her paint project that afternoon, and Mrs. Garrett had looked up from her serving spoon with an expression of sharp interest. "You helped Ellen Conley," she said. "I did," Frederick said. Mrs. Garrett looked at him for a moment. "She asked 6 men in this town for help," she said, "and not one of them showed up." Frederick absorbed this. "That's a shame," he said. "It is a shame, Mrs." Garrett said, with a particularity of emphasis that made it clear the shame resided entirely with the 6 men in question. "Ellen Conley is as good a woman as there is in this county, and she has had a hard year, and this town has done less than it ought." She paused, then added, as though informing him of something that had relevance to matters he might not have considered, "She is a widow, 7 months." "Yes," Frederick said. "I gathered." Mrs. Garrett set the bowl of potatoes down and looked at him with the assessing expression of a woman who had spent decades determining the caliber of the men who passed through her door. Whatever she found in Frederick Bailey's expression apparently satisfied something in her, because she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and resumed serving supper. Chester Banks was not so circumspect. "She's a fine-looking woman," he said, with the cheerful tactlessness of someone who was 22 and had not yet learned that some observations were better kept internal. "I've seen her at the general store." Frederick did not respond to this, and the quality of his silence was apparently informative enough that Chester Banks found something else to discuss almost immediately. After supper, Frederick sat on the front porch of the boarding house with a cup of coffee and thought about the wall, about the quality of the paint he had been using. It was a decent lead white, mixed right, and about the section of soffits at the roofline that had caught his eye and that were in worse shape than the siding, and would need attention once the painting was done. He was thinking about these things, and in the spaces between these practical thoughts, he was also thinking about green eyes that had held their ground and a voice that had been ready to send him away but had not, and the way she had watched him with her daughter with an expression that was guarded and assessing, and just barely, in the corners of it, something else. He had been in a great many places in the past 11 years. He had done good work and kept his own company, and had, on occasion, sat on various porches in various towns, and felt the particular weight of something that was missing in his life, without having been able to name it precisely. He was not in the habit of being impulsive. He was not in the habit of climbing a strange woman's ladder without asking permission. He thought about that and found that he was not sorry about it. He finished his coffee and went to bed. The next morning he ate Mrs. Garrett's breakfast, salt pork and eggs and corn bread, which was a perfectly decent frontier breakfast, and then stopped at the general store to speak with Harold Greer about whether Pete Dawson had made a decision about his room addition, and then he stopped at the livery to speak with Bill Potts about the south wall, and by 10 o'clock he had agreed with Bill Potts on a price for the livery repair work that would start the following week. And he had left word with Harold Greer that he was available to speak with Pete Dawson at Dawson's convenience. He had secured enough work to justify his stay in Harlow Creek for at least 3 weeks, and he was organized about his affairs. By 10:30, he was at Ellen Conley's fence post with his brush. She was already on the ladder. She had started earlier than him, clearly, and had made progress on the south wall. She heard him and looked down, and there was something in her expression that was different from the day before, not softer, exactly, but less defended. She had had a night to decide what she thought about the previous day, and whatever she had decided was reflected in the slight unclenching around her eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Conley," he said, and got the other ladder. They fell into the rhythm of the previous afternoon with a naturalness that was slightly startling to them both. There was something about working beside someone, Frederick thought, that moved past the formalities of conversation faster than the formalities themselves would allow. You learned a person's pace, their method, their level of care. Ellen Conley worked methodically and well, and she did not cut corners, and when she discovered that she had covered a section unevenly, she went back and corrected it without complaint or self-reproach. These things told him about her the way a long conversation might not have. Around 11, she said without preamble, "You said you were a carpenter." "I am," he said. "Then why are you painting?" "Because painting needed doing," he said, "and I can do it, and carpentry is what I do for pay, not the only thing I know how to do." She considered this. "Where are you from originally?" "Tennessee," he said, "a town outside Nashville." "You?" "Ohio," she said. "Cincinnati. I came west with my husband 8 years ago." "What brought him west?" "The same thing that brought everyone west," she said. "The idea that there was more of everything out here. Land, freedom, opportunity." She paused. He was not wrong about the land. "But," Frederick said, because there was clearly a but. "But the West takes things too," she said simply, without self-pity. "It's generous and it's harsh in equal measure, and you have to be willing to meet it on its own terms." "Have you been?" he asked. She looked at him briefly from her ladder. "I'm still here," she said. Frederick thought that was just about the most complete answer a person could give, and he said nothing further, just returned to his painting. But inside him, something that had been quiet for a long time was paying close attention. At midday, she invited him inside for lunch, and he accepted. The kitchen was clean and well-ordered, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a cast-iron stove that was clearly the center of the room's life, and a table that had been mended once at one leg with a carpenter's precision that made Frederick look at it with professional approval. Clara was at the table with her primer and looked up with the frank assessment she had given him the day before. "Are you eating with us?" she asked. "If your mother is willing," he said, looking at Ellen. "I invited him," Ellen told Clara, setting bread and cold beef and a jar of pickled vegetables on the table. Clara turned back to her primer. "He painted the low part better than me yesterday," she said, as though this was mildly objectionable. "He's had more practice," Ellen said. "I could show you some tricks," Frederick offered. Clara looked at him with the expression of a child who was not sure whether to be condescending about this or interested, and interest won slightly. "What kind of tricks?" "Loading the brush properly so you don't drip," he said, "and moving your whole arm instead of just your wrist so you don't get tired." Clara closed her primer with the manner of someone who had abruptly found something more relevant to study. "All right," she said. Ellen watched this exchange over the rim of her water glass and felt the complicated warm thing in her chest assert itself again, more insistently this time. After lunch, Frederick kept his promise to Clara and spent 20 minutes showing her the proper way to load a brush and move from the shoulder, and Clara applied herself to a low section of the west wall with a seriousness that produced genuinely good results, and Ellen stood to the side watching them, leaning against the corner of the house with her arms crossed and her heart doing things she had given it no instruction to do. She had not been prepared for this, she thought. She had been prepared for widowhood, prepared in the sense that she had assessed what her life would need to contain and had set herself to providing those things. She had not been prepared for a stranger to climb her ladder without asking and subsequently demonstrate, over the course of less than 24 hours, that he was patient with children and did not cut corners and answered direct questions directly. She had not been prepared for the way he worked, with a quietness that was companionable rather than withdrawn, or for the fact that he had thought to look at her soffits that morning as she had watched him study the roofline. She had caught him doing it with a professional's eye. She was a careful woman. She had always been a careful woman. But she thought, standing there in the April sun with paint on her hands and her house 3/4 done, that careful and cautious were not the same thing. The next day was a Saturday, and on Saturday mornings Ellen took Clara to the general store for the week's supplies. She was inside the store, consulting her list while Harold Greer pulled things from the shelves, when Dorothy Crane came in and saw her. Dorothy Crane was not a malicious woman, but she was a thorough one, and the situation at Ellen's house had clearly occupied her considerable attention since she had walked past it 2 days earlier. She greeted Ellen and then said, with the careful casualness that everyone in small towns used when they were not being casual at all, "I heard there's a man helping you with your painting." "There is," Ellen said, checking flower off her list. "A stranger," Dorothy said. "Frederick Bailey." "Yes," Ellen said. Dorothy's expression went through several positions in quick succession, and Ellen watched them all without adjusting her own face. She had had practice at this. "People are talking," Dorothy said finally, dropping the pretense of casualness. "People talked when I was painting alone," Ellen said. "I expect they'll find something to say in any circumstance." "Ellen," Dorothy said, and her voice had lost the edge and gone genuine. "I know it isn't fair. I know it isn't. But you have Clara to think about, and you're standing in this town." "My standing in this town was quite comfortable when I was painting my house alone, and every man I asked for help had a convenient backache," Ellen said, pleasantly, without heat. "I don't imagine it was my standing they were protecting." Dorothy had the grace to look somewhat abashed. She was quiet for a moment, then said, more quietly, "What kind of a man is he?" Ellen looked at her directly. "A good one," she said, "from what I can see." She paid for her supplies, collected Clara from where she had been examining the candy jars, and went home. On the road back, Clara said, without looking up from the piece of hard candy she had been given, "Mrs. Crane was asking about Mr. Bailey." "She was," Ellen agreed, "because he's helping you." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment, navigating the candy. Then she said, "Papa used to say that people talked about other people's business because they didn't have enough of their own." Ellen felt the grief move through her in its current form, which was not the sharp thing it had been in October, but a deeper, quieter current that ran beneath everything. "He did say that," she said. "I like Mr. Bailey," Clara said. "He's not like the men who came to the funeral and said they were sorry and then didn't do anything." "No," Ellen said, "he's not." Frederick was at the house when they returned, and Ellen stopped when she turned the corner and saw what he had done. He had not started painting. He had, instead, taken his tools from his canvas bag and was repairing the soffit on the east side that had been pulling away from the roof line. He had a hammer and a pry bar and a length of new wood that he must have gotten from somewhere, and he was working with the focused precision of a craftsman who had identified a problem and was not going to leave it untended. Ellen set her supplies down on the porch steps and walked over. "You didn't need to do that," she said. He looked down at her from where he had propped himself at the roof line. He had not needed a ladder for this, had managed it from the second-story windowsill, which gave her a moment's anxiety. "It would have started to rot by summer," he said. "The painting wouldn't mean much if the wood underneath went bad." She looked up at him. "You are not being paid for this." "I know," he said. "Mr. Bailey, Frederick," he said. "If that's all right." She hesitated. Then, "Frederick, you cannot simply fix every problem you see on my property. This is," she stopped, because she was looking for the word and the word was complicated. "This is a great deal," she said finally. He drove one more nail home, tested the board, and climbed down to stand in front of her. He was perhaps half a head taller than she was, and his expression was the direct, undecorated thing she was coming to recognize as simply his way. "I'm in this town for at least 3 weeks," he said. "I've got work contracted with Bill Potts starting Monday, and I've got afternoons. The soffit needed fixing, and I had wood and I had time. That's all it is, Mrs. Conley." "Ellen," she said, and then heard herself say it and felt the color come up slightly in her face. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the same movement she had seen the first day with Clara, the suppressed thing, the almost smile. "Ellen," he said. That afternoon they finished the south wall and made good progress on the north, and at one point Ellen descended the ladder to move the paint can and Frederick descended his at the same moment, and they nearly collided at the base, and she put her hand out automatically to catch her balance and caught his forearm instead, and they both went very still for exactly 1 second before she stepped back and he stepped back, and Clara, who was sitting on the porch steps reading and had seen all of this, looked at them with the calculating expression of a 7-year-old who had stored the observation for future reference. That evening, sitting at Mrs. Garrett's supper table, Frederick was quieter than usual, and Mrs. Garrett, who noticed everything, did not say anything about it, which was its own form of commentary. On Sunday, Ellen went to church with Clara, and Reverend Pierce gave a sermon about perseverance, which Ellen sat through with perfect composure, and afterward in the churchyard, Harold Greer came up to her and said, with the air of a man who had been working himself up to something, "I heard Bailey's been helping you with the house." I'm sorry I didn't," he stopped, because the apology was too small for the shape of the occasion and he knew it. "It's all right, Harold," Ellen said, because it was the easiest thing to say and she was not in the business of holding grudges, though she noted that the apology came conveniently after someone else had done the work. On Monday morning, Frederick started his contract work with Bill Potts at the livery, and Ellen painted alone. She had expected this and had planned for it and was entirely equal to it, but the south and north walls were done now, and only the west wall remained, the front of the house, the face it showed to anyone passing on the road, and she made excellent progress through the morning and into the afternoon. She was on the ladder painting the section above the porch when she heard boots on the road and looked down to find that it was not Frederick. It was Caleb Morton, the neighbor with the convenient backache, who had apparently decided that the backache had resolved, and who was carrying a paintbrush. Ellen looked at him from the ladder without a word. Caleb Morton had the decency to look thoroughly uncomfortable. He was a man in his 40s, large and weathered, and he was holding the paintbrush as though it had accused him of something. "I thought I'd come help," he said, "if you still need it." Ellen thought about this. "The front wall," she said. "Yes." He painted the lower section while she did the upper, and they worked without a great deal of conversation. And when Frederick arrived at 3:30, having finished his work at the livery, he found 2 people on the wall instead of 1, and stopped at the fence with an expression that contained something that was almost amusement and something else that was not quite jealousy, but was aware of Caleb Morton in a way that it had not needed to be aware of anyone before. Ellen looked down from her ladder and saw his expression, and looked at him for a moment with something in her own face that she had not intended to show, which was a kind of quiet pleasure at the fact that he had come at all, and this was enough information for both of them. Caleb Morton, to his credit, did not stay long after the painting was done for the day, and when he left, Frederick and Ellen stood on the front porch looking at the west wall, which was now nearly finished, and the house looked already like a different thing, fresh and solid and cared for and standing straight in the late afternoon light. "2 more days," Frederick said. "1," Ellen said, "if we start early." He glanced at her. "I'll be here at sunrise," he said. She turned to look at him, and the light was going golden in the way it did in the Texas spring at that hour, and his face was lit sideways, and she thought that she had perhaps been careful long enough. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." She had made coffee for him before, at midday, but this was different and they both knew it. Not the coffee of colleagues taking a break from work, but the coffee of 2 people who wanted to stay in the same room a while longer for reasons that were not about coffee. Clara was inside doing her letters at the kitchen table, and she looked up when they came in and said, "Both of you," as though this confirmed something she had been keeping a private ledger on. "Both of us," Ellen agreed and put the kettle on. They sat at the kitchen table, Clara between them, and drank coffee while Clara showed Frederick her letters, and he was attentive and honest about which ones were well formed and which ones needed more work, and Clara took the corrections with the same equanimity she took everything. And Ellen watched the 2 of them and felt the grief and the love that could exist alongside each other in the heart of a person who had been broken open and rebuilt, and she thought about Thomas, whom she had loved, and she thought about the present tense of her life, and she thought that the heart was larger than it appeared. When Frederick left that evening, he paused at the gate and turned back, and in the gathering dark he said, "Ellen, I want to say clearly that I have not come back each day for the painting. She was on the porch steps and she looked at him across the yard in the dark and she said, "I know." He nodded as though this was sufficient. Then he said, "I would like to know if I could call on you properly, with your permission." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the crickets had come to life in the grass along the fence. Then she said, "Yes, with my permission." He smiled, and it was the full thing this time, not the suppressed corner of the mouth thing, and it was a good smile, warm and real. He tipped his hat, the kind of gesture that was not performance but genuine acknowledgement, and walked down the road toward the boarding house. Ellen stood on the steps until she could not hear his footsteps anymore, and then she went inside and stood in the kitchen and put her hand on the counter and let the thing in her chest be as large as it wanted to be, just for a moment, before she composed herself and went to help Clara with her supper. The next morning they finished the house. They started at sunrise as promised, and the front wall went in the morning, and the trim, which was done in a dark gray that Ellen had mixed herself from a combination of the white paint and a small quantity of lamp black, went in the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock the house was done. All 4 walls, the trim, the soffits, the whole thing fresh and solid and complete, and Ellen stood in the yard with paint on her hands and her apron and a smear of gray on her chin that she had not noticed, and she looked at it. Frederick stood beside her, not close but within the range of what was proper, and he was also looking at the house. "It's a good house," he said. "It is," Ellen said, and her voice was a different thing than it had been on the morning of April the 15th, when she had climbed the ladder alone into the gray dawn. It was not harder or softer, it was fuller. It had more in it. She turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said. "Not the polite kind of thank you. The real kind." "I know the difference," he said. "I believe you do," she said. Clara came around the corner of the house with a streak of gray trim paint on her forearm that she had acquired by being very helpful in a manner that was not quite requested, and she stood between them and looked at the house and said, "It looks nice." "It does," Frederick agreed. "Are you staying in Harlow Creek?" Clara asked him, with the directness of a child asking the question the adults in the room were not asking. Frederick looked at Ellen when he answered. "For a while," he said, "I have work here." Ellen met his gaze. "Good," she said. In the weeks that followed, Frederick Bailey became a fixture in Harlow Creek in the way that a man becomes a fixture, gradually and then all at once, through the accumulation of reliability and work. He finished the livery repair and did it well and on schedule, and Bill Potts told Harold Greer, who told several other people, and by the end of April there were 2 more projects waiting for Frederick's calendar. Pete Dawson's room addition was the largest, and it gave Frederick work through the whole of May and into June. He was on the Dawson property most days by 7 in the morning and done by 4, and on more afternoons than not he stopped by Ellen's on his way back through town. They took to walking in the evenings after supper, when the heat had subsided to something manageable, and the sky went pink and orange in the west in a way that Frederick said reminded him of the painted hills he had seen north of the Red River once, and which Ellen said was simply the sky being its best self before bed. Clara sometimes came with them and sometimes did not, depending on her calculations, which were opaque to Ellen but clearly purposeful. The town watched them with the comprehensive attention of a place where entertainment was limited. Dorothy Crane told her husband Samuel that she thought it was a good thing, and whatever Dorothy thought, her husband thought, and whatever the Cranes thought was a significant opinion in Harlow Creek. Mrs. Garrett, who had been watching Frederick for several weeks with the careful attention of someone who had granted him her provisional good opinion, and was waiting to see if it was warranted, told anyone who asked that he was a man of good character, and that was what mattered. Reverend Pierce, who still felt the particular discomfort of a man who knows he has fallen short, gave a sermon in May about the value of community and helping one's neighbors, and most of the congregation had the decency not to look at Ellen when he said it, which she appreciated. Harold Greer, for his part, asked Frederick one morning in May if he was thinking of putting down roots in Harlow Creek, and Frederick had said that he was considering it, and Harold had nodded and said he was glad to hear it. and then had volunteered without being asked, that there was a piece of land on the south edge of town that had been sitting unclaimed for 2 years because the original owner had gone back east, and that it was good land, well positioned, with a good well on it. Frederick thanked him and went to look at the land that same afternoon. It was good land. Not large, perhaps 12 acres, but solid, with a well, a stand of live oak along the western edge, and a foundation poured for a house that had never been built. Frederick stood on the foundation and looked across the land in the late afternoon light and thought about what could be built here, not abstractly but specifically, the dimensions of rooms, the pitch of a roof, the placement of windows to catch the morning light and deflect the afternoon heat. He thought about these things, and he thought about other things too, things that were harder to hold in the mind because they were not yet concrete, but that had the quality of inevitability that some things had. He bought the land at the end of May. He told Ellen about it on one of their evening walks on a warm Tuesday when the air smelled of new grass and the creek that ran half a mile south of town. "Land," she said. "You are settling here." "I am considering it," he said carefully. "What are you considering?" she asked, equally carefully. He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the road where it curved past a stand of cottonwoods, and the light was doing the pink thing in the west, and Clara was not with them tonight, having declared that she was tired and was going to stay home with her primer, a declaration that Ellen had received with a perfect straight face. "I am considering," Frederick said, "whether I have given you enough time." Ellen looked at him. "Enough time for what?" she said, though she knew. "To decide what you think," he said. "About this, about—" He stopped. He was, she had come to know, a man who chose his words with care and who did not fill silence with noise, and this silence was not discomfort, it was the silence of precision. "About whether there could be something more here," he said, "between us." She was quiet for a moment. The cottonwoods moved in the warm evening wind, and the creek said its quiet thing somewhere in the dark to the south. And she thought about Thomas, who would have recognized a good man when he saw one and would have wanted, she knew with certainty, for his wife and daughter to have good things in their lives. She thought about the first morning of April the 15th, alone on the ladder in the gray dawn, and she thought about a man she had never met climbing up beside her without asking permission and painting with even, honest strokes, and about all the days that had followed. "Frederick," she said, "I decided weeks ago." He looked at her, the gray-green eyes very still. "I have been waiting," she said, "for you to ask." He exhaled slowly as though something that had been wound tight in him had released. Then he said very quietly, "May I?" and offered his hand. She took it. They stood there under the cottonwoods with the pink sky going deep above them, holding hands like two people who had both had long journeys to this particular place, and were going to take a moment to acknowledge that they had arrived. And the evening was warm and quiet and full. And Ellen Conley thought that she had perhaps been braver than she knew on that April morning, climbing her ladder in the gray dawn alone, because everything that came after had come from that. The summer of 1878 in Harlow Creek was a season that the town would remember for several things. A particularly good cattle drive that passed through in June and left the saloon busy for a week. A 4th of July celebration that featured a pie competition, won unexpectedly by Chester Banks, the railroad surveyor, who had turned out to make a devastatingly good cherry pie. And the courtship of Ellen Conley and Frederick Bailey, which the town watched with the invested attention of people who had, belatedly, recognized that they had not done their best by one of their own, and were compensating for it by being enthusiastically supportive of her happiness. Frederick took Ellen to supper at the hotel dining room in early June, which was as formal as Harlow Creek could manage, and they sat across from each other with the good tablecloth between them, and talked for 3 hours about Tennessee and Cincinnati and the Brazos River, and the things that had made each of them into who they were. And by the end of the evening there was not a significant territory of the other's life they had not visited, at least in outline, and the outline felt like a country they could both live in. He met her at the general store one Saturday morning and carried her supplies home without being asked. And Harold Greer watched them walk down the main street together and told Dorothy Crane that he thought things were going well. And Dorothy Crane said that she could see that with her own eyes, Harold, and that she was glad. Clara, for her part, had moved through a series of positions on Frederick Bailey with the thoroughness of a small scientist conducting an experiment. She had been curious, then assessing, then provisionally accepting, and by June she had arrived at the position of full approval expressed through the medium of showing him things, her best drawings, her most recently mastered letters, the particular way she had found to stack the firewood so it didn't fall, and Frederick had received each of these demonstrations with a seriousness that Clara found appropriately respectful. On a warm evening in late June, Clara asked Frederick point-blank. They were on the porch after supper, all three of them, watching the fireflies begin their work in the long grass. "Are you going to stay here forever?" Ellen went very still in the particular way of a person trying not to show that they are holding their breath. Frederick set down his coffee cup and looked at Clara with the direct honesty he always gave her. "I hope to," he said. "If your mother would have me." Clara turned to Ellen. "Would you have him?" Ellen looked at Frederick, and he was looking at her, and in the firefly-lit dusk he had the expression of a man who had said exactly what he meant and was prepared to sit with the consequences of that. "I believe I would," Ellen said. Clara nodded with the expression of a judge who has just delivered a verdict. "Good," she said. "Then you should probably decide soon because Mrs. Garrett charges him $1.50 a week for the room, and that seems like a waste." Frederick laughed, a real laugh, the full-throated kind that Ellen had not heard from him before, and that she thought was one of the finest sounds she had encountered. And Ellen laughed too, and Clara looked at them both with the expression of someone who was pleased to have caused this but would not admit it. Frederick proposed to Ellen on the 4th of July, in the morning before the celebration, on the porch of her house. He had bought a ring in Abilene on a trip he had made the week before for lumber supplies. A modest ring with a small pearl set in silver pearls had come to be accessible in frontier towns by the late 1870s through the railway trade, and he had carried it in his vest pocket for 6 days while he worked on Pete Dawson's room addition, and said nothing. He proposed in plain language, without elaborate speeches, which was appropriate because they were both plain-speaking people who had said most of what needed to be said already in various forms. He said that he loved her and that he wanted to build a life with her and Clara in Harlow Creek, and that he intended to build them a house on his land that would be a proper home, and that he would spend the rest of his days being worthy of the trust she would put in him if she said yes. Ellen said yes. She said it quietly and with her whole self behind it, the way she said important things. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it and looked at him and said, "You went to Abilene for lumber." "I did go to Abilene for lumber," he said, "and incidentally for a ring. The lumber was primary," he said. She kissed him, briefly and firmly, on the front porch in the morning light, and it was the first time they had kissed, and it was neither tentative nor desperate but something in between that was precisely appropriate for two people who had been patient and honest, and had arrived at this moment without hurry and without anything false between them. Clara came out the front door at that moment and stopped and looked at them and then looked at the ring and said, "Is that a pearl?" "It is," Ellen said. "That is very nice," Clara said with the gravity of a connoisseur. "Then, can we still go to the celebration? Chester Banks is defending his pie title." They went to the celebration. The 4th of July in Harlow Creek in 1878 featured a band of 3 men who could collectively produce one coherent song if you gave them sufficient time and space. A series of foot races that Clara entered and finished third in, which she considered acceptable, and the pie competition, which Chester Banks lost narrowly to Dorothy Crane, who had apparently taken the previous year's loss as a personal challenge, and had spent the intervening 12 months perfecting her blackberry pie. Frederick and Ellen walked through the afternoon celebration with the settled quality of two people who had made a decision and were at peace with it, and the town noted this. In Harlow Creek, such things were noted, and the reaction was warm and genuine, or at least the majority of it was. Mrs. Garrett, told by Frederick that morning before he left the boarding house, had cried in the way of a person who is very happy and is not the kind of person who usually cries, and had gripped his hand and said she was proud of him, and then had composed herself and made him an exceptional breakfast. Harold Greer shook Frederick's hand with the earnestness of a man who was also, in some inarticulate way, making peace with himself. Dorothy Crane embraced Ellen with genuine warmth and said she was delighted, and her sincerity was complete. Reverend Pierce, who had finally done the thing he should have done months ago and was now running the town's moral temperature with better accuracy, looked genuinely pleased and said he hoped they would let him perform the ceremony. There were a few people who had reservations. This was the nature of small towns and of the era, where a widow remarrying within a year of her husband's death still raised eyebrows in some quarters, and where a man from outside was always slightly suspect until proven reliable. But these reservations were minority positions and quiet ones, and they did not significantly disturb the general warmth of the afternoon. They set the wedding date for September, which gave Frederick time to make substantial progress on the house he was building on his land, and gave Ellen time to manage the practical arrangements, and to write to her sister in Cincinnati and Thomas's mother in Missouri, which she did with the care that such letters required, acknowledging Thomas fully and honestly, and speaking about Frederick with the honesty he deserved. Thomas's mother, Sarah Conley, wrote back a letter that Ellen read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August, and which made her cry in a way that was grief and gratitude simultaneously. Sarah wrote that she had known her son well, and that he had loved Ellen and Clara with everything he had, and that he would not have wanted them to be alone, and that if this man was good, and she wrote that she could hear in Ellen's letter that he was, then she was glad, and that Thomas's memory was not diminished by the living going on, but was held in it, and she sent her blessing. Ellen kept the letter and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered. The house Frederick was building on the 12 acres went up through July and August, with the speed and quality of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and had been thinking about these rooms for months. He had helped Pete Dawson, whose room addition had given him a favorable opinion of Frederick, contributed several Saturdays of labor, and Bill Potts's son, a 20-year-old named Henry who was handy with a hammer, worked alongside Frederick on most weekdays. The house had 4 rooms, a kitchen and main room on the ground floor and 2 bedrooms above, with a plan for a third when it was needed. The windows were generous, positioned as Frederick had planned on the foundation that night in May, and the porch faced east to catch the morning and provide shade from the afternoon sun. Ellen visited the site on a Saturday in August, brought lunch, and walked through the framed structure with Frederick pointing out rooms and angles and the view from the upstairs windows, which was wide and open and encompassed the live oak stand to the west and the Brazos Valley in the distance, a long, quiet, horizontal blue-green. "There," she said, standing at the upstairs window that faced west. "That's where I want a chair." "I'll build you one," he said. She turned and looked at him in the open frame of the room. "You build furniture too." "My father was a furniture maker," he said. "I made cabinets and chairs for a while in Tennessee. It's slower than house carpentry, but I like it better." "Then do it," she said. "We'll put a cabinet shop in the east room of the ground floor when the house is—" She stopped. "When our house is full enough that the east room isn't needed for sleeping." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes in the August light, and the word "our" had landed between them with a quiet, solid sound, and he said, "Yes, that's a good plan." They were married on the 15th of September, 1878, in the Harlow Creek church that doubled as a schoolhouse, with Reverend Pierce officiating, and a congregation that was the largest the building had seen since the previous Christmas. Mrs. Garrett made a cake of extraordinary competence. Dorothy Crane and two other women decorated the church with late-season wildflowers gathered from the hillside. Chester Banks, who had appointed himself unofficial town musician for all significant occasions, played a hymn on his battered fiddle with more enthusiasm than skill, and the congregation generously sang over the imprecise passages. Ellen wore a dress that she had made herself in the preceding weeks, not white, which was impractical, but a deep blue that was close enough to know that it served the purpose, with buttons of polished bone and a collar that was the most intricate thing she had made in years. Frederick wore the best suit he had, which he had pressed at Mrs. Garrett's and which fit him well enough that Dorothy Crane told her husband he was a fine-looking man, and her husband said, "Yes, dear, I can see that." Clara stood beside Ellen during the ceremony in a new dress that Frederick had bought without asking, in the correct size, which Ellen had not asked how he had managed, and Clara held her mother's flowers with the expression of someone who has stewarded a project to its proper conclusion and is appropriately satisfied. Reverend Pierce read the vows with feeling and specificity, and when he came to the part that asked if anyone present had objection to this union, there was a silence of approximately 2 seconds that felt thorough and complete, and then he moved on, and Ellen and Frederick looked at each other and made their promises in the voices of people who meant them entirely. After the ceremony and the reception in the churchyard, where there was food enough from the contributions of the congregation to feed the town twice over, and where the dancing went past dark and the fireflies were out again, and the night was warm and the fiddle was adequate, and the company was good, Frederick and Ellen left in the buckboard he had acquired along with the land, with Clara asleep on the seat between them, her head on Ellen's shoulder, and drove to the house that was not yet finished but was livable, its windows lit from inside by the lamps Ellen had placed that morning, and it stood in the September dark on the 12 acres against the live oak stand and looked like exactly what it was, a home that had been built with intention. They carried Clara inside and put her in her bedroom, which was the one with the quilt that had been Thomas's mother's, sent from Missouri by Sarah Conley as a wedding gift with a note that said, "For Clara's room in her new home, for the warmth of it." Then Frederick and Ellen stood in the kitchen that smelled of new wood and lamp oil, and the remains of the pot of coffee Ellen had made that morning, and the house was quiet around them, and the September night was outside the windows, and they were home. The autumn of 1878 in Harlow Creek was soft and long, the way Texas autumns sometimes were, warm through October, with a November that came slowly and gave fair warning before it turned properly cold. Frederick finished the house through October, adding the details that made it fully livable: the trim work, the cabinet by the east window, the built-in shelves in the kitchen, and the chair he had promised Ellen for the west-facing upstairs window, which he made from oak that he took from a fallen tree on the property, and which took him 3 evenings to complete, and which she sat in on the night he finished it and looked out at the dark prairie and said was perfect. He set up a small workshop in the east room of the ground floor, as they had planned, and began taking furniture commissions from the town and from the outlying farms. The furniture work fit with his carpentry in a way that made a whole enterprise. He built and repaired structures in the mornings and crafted furniture in the afternoons, and the workshop smelled of fresh wood shavings and linseed oil and was, he realized, the closest thing to a permanent place he had had since he was a boy in his father's workshop in Tennessee. Clara settled into the new house with the pragmatism of a child who was fundamentally oriented toward whatever was in front of her. She transferred her primer and her drawings and her particular arrangement of the firewood to the new space without ceremony, and by the end of the first week had established the new kitchen table as her study zone with the same authority she had held over the old one. She called Frederick by his first name, as she always had, and this suited both of them. Ellen planted a winter garden along the south wall of the house, in beds that Frederick had framed from cedar planks, and put in the hardy things cabbage and turnips and onions, that would carry them through the cold months. She continued her sewing work from the house, and the new sewing room, a corner of the main room she had fitted with the best light, was organized to her complete satisfaction. In November, Ellen told Frederick she was expecting a child. She told him on an evening after supper, when Clara had gone up to bed and they were sitting by the stove in the warm kitchen, and she said it plainly, as she said all things. She watched his face. He went very still for a moment, the way he did when something had moved him enough that the still was the first response. Then his expression did the thing that she had come to know better than most things in the world, the gradual, authentic movement from whatever was held back to whatever was real, and he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her and held her, and she felt the whole of him in that, the steadiness of him, and she closed her eyes and was simply inside it. When? He said into her hair. Late spring, she said. May or June. He pulled back and looked at her, his hands on her arms, and his eyes had that particular quality she had first seen on the ladder in April, the direct and undecorated honesty of him. And in them she saw joy and something like wonder and the complete, uncomplicated commitment of a man who had found his place and intended to stay in it. Clara will be a fine older sister, he said. She will terrify the poor child with helpfulness, Ellen said, and they both laughed. And outside the November wind moved through the live oak stand with a sound like water, and the stove was warm and the house held them. Clara was told the next morning at breakfast, and received the information with the assessing seriousness she brought to all significant news. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Will it be a girl or a boy?" "We don't know yet," Ellen said. "I would prefer a brother," Clara said, "because there are already enough girls making decisions around here." This observation was so accurately self-aware that Frederick laughed into his coffee and Ellen put her hand over her mouth. "We'll see what comes," Ellen said. The winter was mild and Frederick's carpentry and furniture business continued to grow. By January, he had orders enough to keep the workshop busy through the spring, and he had hired Henry Potts 2 days a week to help with the larger pieces. He was known in Harlow Creek now not as the stranger who had painted Ellen Conley's house, but as Frederick Bailey, the builder, whose furniture was solid and true and made to last, and who had become the kind of man in a community that a community needed, and knew it had reliable and skilled and present. He was also known, by this point, as Ellen's husband, and this was the designation he valued most. Spring came to the Brazos Valley in the particular extravagant way of Texas springs, the wildflowers erupting first in the low places, and then across the open land, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and the yellow of black-eyed Susans, and Ellen worked in her garden through March and April as she grew larger, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had painted her own house, and had no intention of being reduced to the passive by the state of her body. Though she allowed Frederick to carry the heavy buckets and to prune the upper branches, and to do the things that were genuinely unreasonable for her to attempt, and she accepted these accommodations with more grace than she would have predicted of herself. Frederick was attentive in the manner that was his way, not fussy or hovering, but present and practical, noticing what needed doing and doing it, making sure the east window was always unlatched so the kitchen stayed cool in the afternoon, leaving her coffee warm and ready when she came downstairs, learning over the winter what she needed before she had to ask for it, which was the kind of love that was not dramatic but was as constant as water. They had evenings together that they would carry for the rest of their lives. The fire in the stove, Clara reading or drawing, Frederick working at the kitchen table on the drawings he made for his furniture commissions, Ellen sewing or reading or simply being in the room with him, the easy quiet of people who were entirely comfortable in each other's company. They talked about everything, about the house, about the workshop, about Clara's education, about the nature of the country they lived in and the changes coming, about the hard things and the simple things with equal frankness. They talked, one evening in April, about what it was like for Ellen to have come west as a woman, to have been dependent on circumstances and on Thomas, and then on the goodwill of a town that had managed the goodwill imperfectly. She told him about the 6 men she had asked, and about the morning she had climbed the ladder alone, and about what it had felt like to know that the choice was between doing it alone or not doing it. "Were you angry?" he asked. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "And I'm not ashamed of that. The anger was appropriate." He nodded. "It was," he said. "What they did or didn't do, it was a refusal that said something about how this town saw you. It said that a woman alone was a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped," she said. "And I wasn't going to accept the management, so I did it myself." He was quiet for a moment. "And then some fool climbed your ladder without asking," he said. She smiled. "The fool did ask," she said, "just after the fact." "I should have asked first," he said, and he meant it. "You should have," she agreed. "But I will tell you that in the whole of that day, of everyone who looked at me on that ladder, you were the only one who came close enough to matter. So I'll forgive the sequencing." He took her hand across the table and she let him hold it, and the kitchen was warm and Clara was asleep upstairs, and outside the April night smelled of new grass and the faint sweetness of the bluebonnets that had come up along the fence line, and it was exactly as good as it needed to be. On the 5th of June, 1879, Ellen gave birth to a son. It was a hard labor, the way first labors often were, long and determined with Mrs. Garrett present, who had delivered several babies in her time and had steady hands and good sense, and with Frederick in the house, not in the room, because that was not how these things were managed, but in the kitchen below, where he sat at the table for 6 hours and worked on a set of chair legs that he was not actually seeing, and listened to the sounds of the house above him with the particular stillness of a man in whom every internal alarm is sounding, but who has understood that his job, in this particular moment, is to stay calm. Clara sat beside him for the first 3 hours, then fell asleep with her head on the table, and he put his hand on her hair gently so as not to wake her. When Mrs. Garrett came down the stairs at 2:30 in the morning and said that mother and child were well, and he had a fine son, Frederick put his head down and pressed both hands flat on the table, and held that position for approximately 15 seconds, before he looked up with an expression that Mrs. Garrett would describe to her neighbor the following morning as the most thoroughly happy she had ever seen on a human face. He went upstairs, and Ellen was tired and completely present in the way she was after hard things, the way the surface of water is smooth after a storm has passed through, and she was holding the boy, who was solid and red-faced and equipped with a voice that had already demonstrated its capabilities. She looked up at Frederick and said, "Come and see." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the son he had not known, until that moment, how completely he had been waiting for. The boy had dark hair already, damp and fine, and a face that was new and complete and extraordinary. "He needs a name," Ellen said. They had discussed names through the winter and into the spring without settling. Now Frederick looked at the boy's face and said, "Thomas." Ellen was quiet. He looked at her. "If that is all right," he said, "Thomas, after the man who loved you and Clara and built you a life here, so he's remembered in something good." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had arrived with a second brush and had not asked permission and had become, in the space of 14 months, the whole geography of her daily life, and she felt the grief and the love do the thing they did, the complicated, beautiful coexistence of them, and she said, "Thomas Frederick Bailey." He nodded once, and his expression was the full one, the unguarded one. "Yes," he said, "that's right." Clara was woken and brought upstairs to meet her brother, and she looked at him with the critical thoroughness of someone inspecting a delivered order and said, "He's smaller than I expected." "He'll grow," Frederick said. Clara looked at the baby's face for a long moment, then looked at her mother, then looked at Frederick. "Thomas is a good name," she said. "It is," Ellen said. Clara settled herself against her mother's side and looked at the baby with an expression that was, under all the scrutiny and the seriousness, entirely tender, and the room was full of the quiet that follows arrival, the specific piece of a thing that has been awaited and has come, and the June night was warm beyond the windows, and the live oak stand made its sound in the wind like water, and the house was as full as a house could be. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1879, Harlow Creek continued its modest life, and within it, the life of the Bailey household continued with a richness that was not dramatic but was deep. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who was interested in everything, and who by 8 months was attempting locomotion with a determination that led to a great many collisions with furniture and no apparent reduction of enthusiasm. Clara was invested in his development the way a senior craftsman is invested in an apprentice. She took the work of teaching him things with complete seriousness, and by the time Thomas was a year old, Clara had taught him to clap and to wave and to say a version of her name that sounded like Kawa, which she accepted with the dignity of a person who understands that pronunciation is a developing skill. Frederick's carpentry business had expanded enough by the autumn of 1879 that he needed a second person regularly, and he offered the position to Henry Potts full-time, and Henry accepted with an enthusiasm that was partly about the work and partly about the fact that Henry was 21 and had been making eyes at Dorothy Crane's niece, who had moved to Harlow Creek in the spring, and being stably employed was a prerequisite to that project proceeding. The furniture that came out of Frederick's workshop began to be known beyond Harlow Creek. A set of kitchen chairs that Pete Dawson's wife had shown to her cousin in Abilene, and the cousin had ordered a set, and the Abilene order had led to another, and by the end of 1879, Frederick was filling orders that came from as far as 50 miles away, which in the Texas of 1879 was a significant radius. One evening in October, when Thomas was asleep and Clara was in her room, Ellen and Frederick sat on the east-facing porch in the cool evening and looked at the property in the dusk. The garden was done for the year, the beds covered with mulch, the workshop was quiet, the horses were in the small paddock Frederick had built along the south fence, and the live oaks at the western edge were making their water sound in the October wind. "I want to tell you something," Ellen said. He looked at her. "I was afraid," she said. "When I climbed that ladder on the 15th of April, I was not afraid of the height. I was afraid of what it meant, that I was doing it alone, that the town had left me to it, that this was what my life was going to be. A woman doing everything alone because that was what was expected of her." She paused. "And then you appeared. And the thing that I felt after I got over being irritated about it was I was not alone anymore, not because you painted a wall, but because you treated it as the obvious thing to do. There was no performance in it, no favor granting. You just saw what needed doing and did it." Frederick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to tell you something too." She looked at him. "I have been in a great many places in my life," he said, "and I have done good work in all of them, and I was always ready to move on. I didn't think there was a particular place that would hold me. And then I saw you on that ladder, and I thought, that woman is doing something difficult and doing it with her whole self, and no one is helping her, and that needs to be addressed." He paused. "I thought I was stopping for 20 minutes. I stopped for the rest of my life." She reached over and took his hand, and he folded his around hers, and they sat on the east-facing porch of the house he had built for them and watched the dark come down over the Brazos Valley, and there was nothing unfinished between them, nothing left unsaid that needed saying, no thread left loose, no door left open to a cold wind. The October stars came out one by one above the live oaks, the way they did in that part of Texas where there was not enough lamplight to diminish them, and they were brilliant and numerous and indifferent in the beautiful way of natural things. And under them the house was warm and the children were sleeping, and the workshop smelled of cedar and linseed oil, and the horses were quiet in the paddock. And Ellen Conley Bailey, who had climbed a ladder alone in a gray April dawn with a brush, and a will that the world had not succeeded in diminishing, held her husband's hand in the cool October evening and was completely, thoroughly, irreversibly home. In the years that followed, Harlow Creek grew in the slow way of prairie towns. A new family arriving in 1880. The railroad surveyors returning in 1881 with serious intent. Talk of a proper school building that finally materialized in 1882, when Frederick and Henry built it on a commission from the county, and Clara, who was by then 12, and had thoroughly exhausted the limits of what the old church schoolhouse could teach her, was one of the first students to walk through its new door. The Dawson family had a third child. The Cranes' niece married Henry Potts in a ceremony attended by everyone in town, and Frederick built them a house as a wedding gift, taking 3 months off his commercial work to do it, and Ellen watched him do this and loved him in the way that is quieter and larger than the first kind, the love that has been through seasons and knows the whole person. Thomas learned to walk at 13 months and immediately began an earnest relationship with every piece of Frederick's workshop that was at toddler height, and Frederick learned to secure his tools with the methodical completeness of a man who had come to understand that his son would test every boundary with the thoroughness of a professional. Clara taught Thomas to read when he was 4, using the same primer she had used, and sat with him at the kitchen table every evening the way Ellen had sat with her. And this was one of the things Ellen remembered, years later, as an image that said everything about who her children were. Frederick built Ellen a larger sewing room in 1882, when the demand for her work had grown enough to warrant it. She had taken on 2 girls from town as assistants, teaching them the precise and skilled work that could command fair prices, and the sewing room had become a small enterprise in its own right. He also built her, that same year, the bookcase she had been asking about for 3 years, which held the books she had accumulated, including Thomas's mother Sarah Conley's well-worn Bible that had arrived after Sarah's passing in 1881, bequeathed to Ellen and Clara with a letter that said it was for Clara when she was old enough to fully understand what it had meant to the woman who had carried it. In the spring of 1883, Ellen told Frederick she was expecting again, and this time he received the news with a joy that was quieter and more spacious than the first time. The joy of a man who has already discovered what this gift means and is simply grateful for it. The baby was born in November, a boy again, who they named James Thomas Bailey, and who came into the world with considerably more efficiency than Thomas had, and who, by his first month, had displayed a temperament of such cheerful equanimity that Clara said it was just as well because there was already enough stubbornness in the house. By the mid-1880s, Frederick Bailey's workshop was one of the most respected furniture operations in that part of Texas, known for the quality of its joinery and the honesty of its materials. He had added a 3rd room to the workshop and a 2nd employee alongside Henry, and the work went out to Abilene and to smaller towns in a 2-county radius. And there was talk one year about an order from a hotel being built in Fort Worth, which came through and was the largest single commission in the workshop's history and occupied the whole of a very busy winter. Ellen's sewing operation had become, by the same period, a legitimate small business. She had written out her methods and her pricing structures with the same precision she had always brought to her accounts, and the 2 young women she had trained were skilled enough to take the basic commissions independently while Ellen focused on the more complex work, and the income from it was a solid contribution to the household and to the account she kept separately, which was Ellen's account in her name, which she had established with the quiet determination of a woman who had been financially dependent once before and had decided she would never be without her own resources again. Frederick had supported this without comment or question, and indeed had been the one to suggest it, because he was a man who understood what financial independence meant to a woman who had been without it, and because he trusted her completely, and because the point of a partnership was that both people were whole within it. The Harlow Creek they had come to inhabit was a different place than the one Ellen had painted her house in, not different in its bones, but in the quality of its attention. It had grown enough that a single woman's choices were not the main subject of communal examination. It had, over the years, acquired enough of its own stories and events that the story of the widow and the man with the brush had become part of its local legend rather than its current gossip. People told it, sometimes, to newcomers. How Ellen Conley had painted her house alone, and the stranger had arrived with a second brush and had stayed. It was told as a love story, which it was, and also as something else, a story about who the town had been and who it had tried to become since, and about the things that happened when someone decided to do the necessary thing without waiting for permission. Clara grew up to be a young woman of considerable capability and equal independence. She left Harlow Creek at 18 to attend the New Teachers College in Abilene, the first woman from Harlow Creek to do so, and she came back 2 years later with a certificate and a set of ambitions that the new schoolhouse was capable of containing. And she taught there for several years before she married a cattle rancher from the next county over a quiet, solid man named George Adler who was 28 to her 23, and who looked at Clara with an expression that Frederick recognized. Because it was the expression of a man who has identified the specific quality of a particular person and has concluded that he would like to be in the vicinity of that person for the remainder of his natural life. Frederick walked Clara down the aisle of the church, the proper church, built in 1880 when the congregation had outgrown the schoolhouse, and Ellen sat in the front pew with Thomas on one side and James on the other, and watched her daughter be married with the full heart of a woman who has loved completely, and has been loved in return, and has watched that love multiply outward through the people who came from it, and the people those people loved, and it was almost more than a person could hold. And she held it completely. Thomas grew into a young man who was interested in everything his father built and had a natural aptitude for both the carpentry and the furniture work. And at 16, he began working in the workshop after school, and at 18, he was doing commission work independently and saving to buy his own tools. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet directness, and he had, from Thomas Conley for whom he was named, without ever having met him, some quality of steady goodness that Ellen sometimes felt when she looked at him, the way you feel a wind from a direction you weren't expecting, something received from a distance. James, the younger one, had no interest in furniture or carpentry and every interest in cattle, and at 17, he had announced his intentions with the absolute certainty of a person who has always known what they wanted, and Frederick had taken him to speak with the Adler Ranch, Clara's husband George's operation, about working there in the summers, and by the time James was 20, he was well on his way to the life he had always been pointing at. In the autumn of 1893, 15 years after the April morning on the ladder, Frederick and Ellen sat on the east-facing porch in the cool October evening, much as they had sat on the October evening in 1879, but the house was larger now, and the live oaks at the western edge had grown considerably, and the workshop had its own structure separate from the house, and the paddock was bigger, and the garden beds along the south wall were in their autumnal state, tucked under mulch and waiting. They were both older. Frederick was 49, with silver in his dark hair and the particular quality of a man who has used himself well, not worn out but worn in, the way good wood is worn in, smoother and more true for the use. Ellen was 46, her auburn hair gone to a beautiful deep red-brown with strands of gray, and the green eyes were the same as they had ever been, direct and clear and capable of holding everything they looked at. Thomas and his wife, a sharp and capable young woman named Ruth who had come from a farm family outside of town, and who had, in Ellen's estimation, exactly the character the position required, were expecting their first child in the spring. James was in the next county with the Adler operation, doing well and happy. Clara and George had 3 children of their own, and a household that was, from all accounts, run with the efficiency and warmth one would expect of Clara. The October stars were coming out as they always did, one by one. "Do you remember," Ellen said, When Clara said it was a waste that Mrs. Garrett was charging you $1.50 a week for the room, Frederick smiled. She was not wrong. She was absolutely right, Ellen said. She was 7 years old and she was the most practical person in this town. She still is, he said. They sat with that for a moment, the way they sat with many things, fully and without hurry. I think about that morning sometimes, Ellen said. April, the ladder. So do I, he said. I was so angry, she said, and so tired and so determined, and then you were just there, without asking. I should have asked. You should have asked, she agreed. And I'm glad you didn't. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes in the October dark, and the expression in them was the full, unguarded thing, the one that had moved through the various forms of itself over 15 years, but was always underneath the same, the completely honest version of a man who had found the thing he had been looking for and had never once taken it for granted. Ellen, he said. Frederick, she said. I have been happy here, he said. It was not a complicated statement. It did not need to be. She looked at him, this man who had arrived on a bay horse on a Tuesday afternoon in April 1878, with a canvas bag of tools and a willingness to be useful. And she thought of all the things that had come from that Tuesday, Thomas Frederick Bailey sleeping in a grave that bore his name in a new generation, James Bailey riding cattle in the next county, Clara Adler teaching children in the new schoolhouse, Ruth Bailey carrying the next version of this family forward into the spring, and this house. And this porch and this October night and this man. So have I, she said, so very happy. The October wind moved through the live oaks with its water sound, and the stars were many and brilliant above the Brazos Valley, and the house was warm at their backs, and the workshop smelled of cedar, and somewhere down the road toward town, a horse was moving at a comfortable canter in the dark, the sound of it clear and easy in the still night air, the sound of this country of this time, of a life that had been made from stubbornness and work, and the extraordinary good fortune of two people finding each other on opposite sides of a ladder on a spring afternoon in 1878, and deciding, without elaborate discussion, that they would stay.